You see, Margaret, I explained during a particularly tense family dinner. The building may belong to your developer now, but the true value was never in the real estate. It was in what my grandfather built, not just a collection of antiques, but a legacy of cultural preservation. I handed her a press release. The Chen Sterling Foundation for Cultural Heritage Preservation, it announced, would be established with the proceeds from the auction. The foundation would continue my grandfather's work, helping to identify, authenticate, and repatriate lost cultural treasures. Sterling? Margaret asked weakly. Yes, I smiled. David and I will co-chair the foundation. After all, you always said a Sterling should be involved in something appropriate. David, who had been quietly supportive once he understood the true scope of what his mother had tried to destroy, took my hand. It's more than appropriate, Mother. It's important. The final auction exceeded everyone's expectations. The pieces that weren't being returned to museums sold for over $50 million. The Chen Sterling Foundation launched with international acclaim, backed by major museums and cultural institutions worldwide. Margaret, to her credit, eventually admitted her mistake. I was wrong, she said during the foundation's opening gala. I looked at your grandfather's shop and saw what I expected to see. I never bothered to look deeper. That's exactly what grandfather counted on, I replied. He knew that people who judge by appearances would never understand the true value of what they were looking at. The foundation's first project was to establish a proper museum and cultural center in the historic district, not far from where Chen's Curiosities had stood. We hired experts in art history and preservation, created educational programs, and continued my grandfather's work of protecting cultural heritage. The developer who bought the building, faced with intense public pressure and excellent PR opportunities, eventually agreed to preserve the original storefront as a historical landmark. It now serves as the foundation's welcome center, complete with a plaque honoring Henry Chen's legacy. Mr. Zhang, who had kept my grandfather's secrets for so many years, became one of our senior advisors. Henry would be proud, he told me at the museum's opening. You didn't just preserve his collection, you fulfilled his true mission. As for David, the experience transformed him. Free from his mother's narrow vision of success, he discovered a passion for art history and conservation. We work together now, traveling the world to help other families and collectors preserve and protect their cultural heritage. Margaret still struggles sometimes with her new role as the mother-in-law of an internationally respected art preservationist. But she's learning, slowly, that true value isn't always measured in real estate or social status. Last month, she even attended one of our foundation's lectures on Ming Dynasty porcelain. I caught her afterward, studying the umbrella stand that had started it all, now properly displayed in a climate-controlled case. I never would have believed it, she admitted. All those years, I walked past treasures and saw only junk. That's exactly what made my grandfather's work possible, I replied. He understood that sometimes the best way to protect something precious is to let people underestimate its worth. The foundation continues to grow, carrying forward my grandfather's legacy in ways that would have made him proud. We've helped recover lost artworks, preserved cultural heritage sites, and created educational programs that teach new generations the importance of protecting our shared cultural history. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working in my office at the museum, I think I can smell the familiar scents of Chen's Curiosities, old wood, ancient silk, and the particular dust that seems to cling to antiques. In those moments, I can almost hear my grandfather's voice. Remember, little dragon, true value isn't always obvious. He was right, of course. The true value of his legacy wasn't just in the priceless artifacts he preserved, but in the lesson he taught me, that sometimes the greatest treasures are protected by the very prejudices of those who think they know better. Last week, a young girl visited the museum with her school group. I watched her studying the exhibits with the same intensity I once brought to my grandfather's shop. When she asked about the story behind a particular piece, I found myself saying, "Remember, sometimes the most precious things look ordinary to those who don't know how to see." Her eyes lit up with understanding, and I knew my grandfather's legacy would live on, teaching new generations to look beyond the surface and find the true value in things others might dismiss as worthless. That's why the Historical Society's authentication experts are examining them right now. They're particularly interested in the hidden rooms mentioned in Crawford's journal. Hidden rooms? James looked around as if seeing the house for the first time. Apparently, Crawford used this house as a testing ground for several architectural innovations, including some rather ingenious hidden spaces that even I haven't found yet. The contractor was already running his hands along the walls with new interest. If this is really a Crawford, it changes everything. The historical value alone is nothing compared to the practical considerations. Margaret cut in sharply. The property value would increase exponentially if this is authenticated as one of the last surviving Crawford houses. I finished, especially with his original plans and journal to prove it. James stepped closer to me. Why didn't you tell me about this sooner? Because I just found the proof today, in that attic you wanted to demolish. I met Margaret's gaze steadily, behind a false panel that would have been destroyed if we'd started tearing things down without proper research. The contractor was already packing up his tablet. I can't touch this place until the Historical Society makes their determination. The liability alone. Thursday, I said, watching Margaret's perfect composure crack slightly. The authentication experts will have their preliminary findings by Thursday, including, I expect, confirmation that this house qualifies for not just local but national historic protection status. You can't do this, Margaret hissed as the contractor left. Do you have any idea what this property could be worth with a modern estate built on it? Actually, I do, I replied, just as I know what it's worth as one of the last surviving examples of Crawford's residential work, complete with original documentation and innovative architectural features that were decades ahead of their time. James was still looking around the house with new eyes. Crawford really built this, and those plans you found prove it, along with his personal journal describing every innovation he incorporated into the design. I pulled out my phone, showing him the photos I'd taken. Look at these sketches, these notes. He used this house as a laboratory for ideas that wouldn't become common in residential architecture for another 50 years. This is absurd, Margaret snapped. James, surely you're not going to let some moldy old papers stop us from maximizing this property's potential. But James wasn't listening. He was reading Crawford's elegant handwriting, his expression changing as he realized what we had. Mom, he said slowly, if this is real, if this house is what Claire says it is, it's worth far more preserved than destroyed. I finished, both financially and historically. Margaret grabbed her purse. This isn't over. Those documents will need to be authenticated. The historical significance will need to be proven. Of course, I agreed. That's exactly what's happening on Thursday. Would you like to be present when the experts make their determination? She left without answering, practically dragging her husband behind her. James stayed, wandering from room to room, seeing with new appreciation the details we'd lived with for years. I had no idea, he murmured, running his hand along a particularly intricate piece of molding. All this time. That's why research matters, I said softly. That's why I've been fighting so hard to understand this house before making any irreversible decisions. My phone buzzed, a message from Lisa. Initial authentication looking positive. Carbon dating on the paper and ink consistent with 1872. You're not going to believe what else we found in those documents. I smiled, thinking of the other surprises still hidden in Crawford's journal. Thursday would bring more than just authentication results. It would bring vindication, protection for our home, and a complete reversal of the power dynamic with my in-laws. But for now, I had more research to do. After all, Crawford's journal had mentioned several hidden rooms that had yet to be discovered, and something told me those rooms might hold even more secrets worth protecting. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the Victorian windows, illuminating decades of history that had almost been lost to practical considerations. Sometimes I thought the most practical thing you can do is take the time to understand what you already have. Thursday would prove just how right that philosophy could be. Thursday morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for the historical assessment that would change everything. The house seemed to glow in the early light, as if it knew its secrets were finally about to be revealed. Dr. Eleanor Wright, the Historical Society's lead authenticator, arrived precisely at 9, accompanied by a team of preservation experts. To my surprise, a film crew from the local PBS station followed. Apparently, news of a potential Samuel Crawford discovery had leaked. The press wasn't my doing, Lisa whispered as we watched the team set up their equipment. But after what we found in those documents last night, I nodded, thinking of our late-night discovery in Crawford's journal. The architectural innovations were just the beginning. "Your in-laws are here," James announced from the front window. Sure enough, Margaret and Robert Bennett were making their way up the path, followed by their lawyer and a private antiquities expert they'd hired. "Let them come," I murmured. "They should see this." The living room became a makeshift command center as Dr. Wright's team laid out their findings. The original plans, Crawford's journal, and photographs of architectural details were arranged on tables. The PBS crew filmed everything, capturing what could be a major historical discovery. "Mrs. Bennett," Dr. Wright began formally, addressing me rather than Margaret, much to my mother-in-law's obvious irritation. "We've completed our preliminary authentication of the documents. Would you like to hear our findings?" "Please," I replied as Margaret shifted impatiently. "The architectural plans are definitively original Samuel Crawford documents, dated 1872. Paper composition, ink analysis, and handwriting authentication all confirm this." She held up the journal. "This personal journal is also authentic, and its contents are remarkable." "Remarkable how?" Margaret interrupted. "Old houses had hidden rooms all the time. That hardly makes this one special." Dr. Wright smiled. "Ah, but this house wasn't just any hidden room design. According to Crawford's journal, this house was built as part of the Underground Railroad, with innovative concealment features that were decades ahead of their time." The room went silent. Even the camera crew stopped moving. "The Underground Railroad?" James breathed. "Here." Crawford's journal details how he incorporated escape routes and hiding spaces throughout the house. Dr. Wright continued. "But he did it in a way that was architecturally revolutionary. The hidden rooms aren't just spaces. They're part of an integrated ventilation and support system that help the house function better while concealing its true purpose." She turned to the architectural plans. "Look at these storage spaces he designed. They appear to be ordinary closets and pantries, but they're actually part of a complex network of safe rooms." The ventilation system he created to serve these spaces later became a standard feature in modern buildings. But he developed it here, 50 years before its time. Margaret's antiquities expert leaned forward, studying the plans. "These are certainly innovative designs, but proving they were actually built is exactly what we're doing today." Dr. Wright finished. She gestured to her team. "We've brought ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging equipment. With Mrs. Bennett's permission, we'd like to confirm the existence of these spaces." I nodded, watching Margaret's face carefully. Her lawyer was whispering something in her ear, but her expression remained fixed. The next few hours were extraordinary. The preservation team moved methodically through the house, their equipment revealing hidden passages exactly where Crawford's plans showed them. Behind what appeared to be solid walls, spaces opened up. Concealed doors, marked in Crawford's plans but invisible to the naked eye, were discovered. "This is extraordinary," the PBS producer breathed as another hidden room was located. A piece of civil rights history preserved in architectural innovation. But the biggest discovery came in what we thought was a root cellar. The ground-penetrating radar revealed a tunnel, extending beyond the property lines. According to Crawford's journal, Lisa explained, reading from her notes, this tunnel connected to a network that ran throughout the city. He designed it with a ventilation system that kept the air fresh and prevented detection. James stood in the cellar, touching the walls with new reverence. "All this time, we've been living in a piece of history." "Not just history," Dr. Wright corrected. "This house represents a unique combination of architectural innovation and social justice." Crawford wasn't just hiding people. He was developing new construction techniques that would later revolutionize building design. Margaret's lawyer cleared his throat. "Given these findings, what kind of protection status are we looking at?" "National Historic Landmark status," Dr. Wright replied firmly. "This property isn't just architecturally significant, it's a crucial piece of American history. The preservation grants alone would cover any restoration costs." I watched the fight drain out of Margaret's face as she realized what this meant. Not only could she not tear down the house, but its value had just increased exponentially, not as a teardown, but as a preserved historical site. "The Bennett family real estate group could benefit from this," I said quietly, approaching her. "Imagine the publicity. Historic preservation specialists instead of luxury development. There's a growing market for historically significant properties." She stared at me for a long moment. You didn't you? You suspected what this house was all along. I knew it was special, I admitted. That's why I kept researching, kept looking for proof. Some things are worth taking time to understand. The PBS crew was interviewing Dr. Wright about the significance of the discovery. James joined me, slipping his arm around my waist. I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner, he murmured. You were right about this place. Over the next few months, our house underwent a transformation, not into a modern estate, but into a carefully restored historical landmark. The Bennett family real estate group, under Margaret's surprisingly enthusiastic direction, launched a new division specializing in historical property preservation. The hidden rooms were carefully documented and partially open for educational tours. Schools brought students to learn about the Underground Railroad and the architectural innovations that had protected its passengers. The PBS documentary aired nationally, bringing attention to the importance of preserving historical properties. One evening, about a year after our discovery, I found Margaret in the library, running her hand along the now revealed edge of a hidden door. I never thought preservation could be as profitable as development, she admitted. But the prestige of handling these properties, the grants, the tax benefits, were doing better than ever. And doing good at the same time, I added. She nodded slowly. You know, my grandmother used to tell stories about houses like this one. Places that looked ordinary but held such important secrets. I never thought I'd be responsible for preserving one. The house creaked gently around us, its old bones settling into the evening. In Crawford's journal, he'd written about building not just for his time, but for the future. He believed that good architecture could serve both practical purposes and moral ones. James joined us, carrying the leather-bound journal that had started it all. The Historical Society found more Crawford documents in their archives. 3 more houses he might have designed in the city. Really? Margaret's eyes lit up with new interest. We should look into those properties. I smiled, leaving them to their discussion. Through the Victorian windows, the setting sun painted the rooms in shades of amber, just as it had done for over 150 years. In the basement, tourists were probably still exploring the tunnel that had once led to freedom. Upstairs, preservation experts were documenting Crawford's innovative ventilation system for modern architects to study. My phone buzzed, another interview request, this time from an international architecture magazine. The story of our house had sparked a renewed interest in historical preservation worldwide. Developers were starting to look at old buildings with new eyes, wondering what secrets they might hold. But the real victory wasn't in the publicity or the preservation status or even the increased property value. It was in the way the house had transformed us all. Margaret, from a destroyer of history to its protector. James, from focusing on practical concerns to understanding the value of heritage. And me? I learned that sometimes the best way to win isn't to fight, but to reveal the truth so compelling that it changes your opponents into allies. That evening, I sat in what we now knew had been Crawford's personal study, reading more of his journal. His words, written nearly 150 years ago, seemed to speak directly to our time. A house is not merely walls and rooms, but a vessel for human courage and innovation. In designing these spaces, I hope to serve not only those who need shelter now, but those who will come to understand their significance in years to come. Outside, tourists were still taking photos of the house's historic facade. Inside, the old walls held their secrets a little less tightly now, sharing their story with a world finally ready to appreciate it. Sometimes, I thought, the greatest victories don't come from destroying the old to build the new, but from helping others see the value of what already exists. And sometimes, the most powerful way to preserve history is to prove that it's still relevant today. As the sun set on our historic home, I could almost imagine Crawford himself standing in this very room, designing not just a house, but a legacy. A legacy that, thanks to a hidden journal and some determined research, would now be preserved for generations to come. And that, more than any modern mansion, was worth fighting for.